melting bones, severed limbs, sloshing skin, bursting muscles, and beyond. Of all the horrors we see on screen, none are more visceral than body horror. Over the decades, the imagery and themes of the genre have spilled into films, games, paintings, etc., becoming ever more prevalent even in mainstream media. And while some may try to disregard this gory subgenre as gross for the sake of grossness, bearing little value beneath its shock, when we genuinely examine body horror, it can make us reconsider the boundaries of being human in the electric age. This art form functions as a prophetic, twisted, too real reflection of who we have become in the 21st century. As humanity continues to metamorphose, body horror may reveal what it is that we're steadily turning into. So, in this video, we're first going to lay out some foundational understandings of what body horror is by identifying its basic visual components, narrative functions, and general categories. And then we will use the lens of media studies to discuss how body horror art can help us comprehend the human condition in the electric age. Right away, I would like to say that in the second half of this video, I'm going to express something that has never been said about body horror before, and it will involve a heavy academic discussion of Marshall McLuhan's ideas covering how media, electricity, and literacy relate to body horror. This essay is the first introductory video in a series of body horror essays that I will release over the course of this year. This introduction is intended both as entertainment and as a tool for future research into body horror media. I strongly encourage all of you to engage the following ideas in your own body horror analyses, as I am trying to begin a conversation here. If you are interested in supporting this endeavor, please consider subscribing, joining our Discord, or funding this project on Ko-fi. I'll be brief here, but to help in contextualizing this video series, I would like to add a bit about my own history with body horror. If you just want the content, go ahead and skip to the next timestamp. My love of body horror began in 2015 with my first Bloodborne playthrough. After finishing the game several times and seeing some of its surrounding essay discourse, it became apparent to me that the grotesque designs of its creatures captured a rarely displayed truth of the human condition, that most of who we are is determined by our bodies. Since then, I have become a connoisseur of body horror art, consuming it in the forms of literature, films, games, paintings, and consequently designing my own explorations of body horror by writing fantasy prose, tabletop RPG campaigns, and sculpting. Now, to clarify, I am far less interested in the discussion of IRL carnage, as I am primarily concerned with the artistic representations of body horror content that we see in our media, and not real-world violence, as interacting with the two shapes us in distinctly different ways. Personally, I am as fascinated with body horror as much as I am deeply disturbed by it, which has given me all the more reason to discuss it at length. So, to paraphrase Banksy, I hope this video series disturbs the comfortable and comforts the disturbed. And with that out of the way, let us journey into the realms of unstable flesh.
The polymorphousness of living tissue has the capacity to traverse all boundaries, to undo the rigidities of organic function and symbolic articulation. New arrangements of flesh break down traditional binary oppositions between mind and matter, image, object, self, other, inside, outside, male, female, nature, culture, human and inhuman, organic and mechanical.
If there is anything you should take away from this essay about body horror, it is that at its core, it is a genre of collapsing boundaries. It explores how bodily borders shrivel and swell in ways that we thought impossible, so that we may for a moment glimpse what we are becoming. More on that later. In terms of genre history, the term body horror originated in Philip Brophy's 1983 article Horrality, the Textuality of the Contemporary Horror Film. However, this subgenre predates its own label by about a century, as some argue that Mary Shelley's 1818 novel Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus is the first example of an explicit body horror narrative. And while imagery and themes of body horror stretch throughout all of human history in the forms of disease, torture, etc., body horror as a label generally includes only the artistic representations of these concepts, which have become more prevalent since the 1800s with the rise of Gothic literature. Meanwhile, in terms of genre scholarship, there is currently little academic discussion of body horror. It is generally only mentioned in a couple books such as David Huckvale's Terrors of the Flesh and Xavier Aldana Ray's Body Gothic, and in a few individual essays about specific pieces of media. Notably, a substantial amount of body horror academia is composed of queer and feminist interpretations, with both fields overlapping in their focus on the body. And in case you're interested, there are also quite a few video essays on these interpretations of body horror that you can go ahead and check out. As brilliantly recognized by David Huckvale, body horror is most powerful when viewed from a physicalist framework, which sees humans as nothing more than our material bodies. To clarify for future discussions, what I mean by material or materiality is the idea that an object is purely that, its physical substance. So some may ask, what about metaphysical things like the soul, spirit, and our consciousness? Well, within this framework, those ideas are entirely contingent on the body. So, as an example, consider the mass killer Charles Whitman. He experienced an onset of violent impulses that culminated in his famous mass shooting. In his suicide note, Whitman requested an autopsy of his brain to see if there was any visible physical disorder that was causing his violent urges. Well, as it turned out, there actually was a tumor near his amygdala, the part of the brain involved in emotional and behavioral regulation. Or alternatively consider another example, Phineas Gage, an American railroad construction worker who, in a work accident, tanked a railroad spike through his frontal lobe. The man lived, but according to those around him, his personality became noticeably more impulsive and irreverent compared to his former self. And while both of these cases have been often exaggerated beyond fact, in each instance the identities of these men shifted seemingly as a result of physical changes to their bodies. Not to say that a metaphysical soul is entirely impossible, can't really prove a negative, but as it stands now, we have little evidence to make claims about metaphysics. And okay, even if we make the claim that there is a soul, then where does the body end and the soul begin? Thus, we're left alone with our bodies, in the perfect state to ponder body horror. Alright, so, arguably body horror, of all horror subgenres, gets at the foundational terror of the human condition, for is not all horror rooted in bodies? Even something as abstract as existential terror is tied to the condition of our physicality. Whatever terrible things may happen to us ultimately happen to our bodies, and the bodies of those around us. Now, as a label, body horror is a painfully vague umbrella term for almost any manner of bodily distortions in our media. In their book, Body Gothic, Xavier Reyes defines body horror as a celebration of corporeal instability, mutability, or capacity for transformation. But again, that's still really vague. One could say that a minor scratch on a finger is a type of body horror, functioning as another haunting reminder of one's bodily fragility. By itself, it may be easily dismissed, but given the correct camera angle, maybe ominous lighting, alarmed character reactions, and foreboding music, a simple cut can be presented through the lens of body horror. However, this example does not possess the visceral intensity that is commonly associated with the subgenre, whereas 100 cuts on a finger is much more in line with what we're discussing. So let's be clear, this stuff is pretty relative. Horror is ultimately a subjective label, and one can interpret almost any media through a lens of horror, be it psychological, bodily, existential, etc. So to concretize definitions, we can use Brian Atterbury's fuzzy set theory to make body horror into a spectrum. We will look at the most notable works of body horror, the ones that have been critically acclaimed as the exemplars of the genre, such as David Cronenberg's The Fly and John Carpenter's The Thing, label those definitively as body horror, and then situate other media in relation to those films. The closer a piece of media is in its visuals, themes, and subjects to definitive body horror works, the more it is worth labeling as body horror. But what are these visuals, themes, and subjects? Well, firstly, the visuals of body horror are detailed images of bodily transformation, contortion, or destruction. For example, a film can portray a car crash from a distance, maybe showing a limp hand of a victim to signify death, but a film can also present the victim's body as a mass of red, not even remotely resembling a human, almost shoving the camera into the gore practical effects. An intact corpse can be easily romanticized, still resembling something human, as though the soul of the dead has left its shell and went on elsewhere, while the red mess leads one to ponder whether there was ever a human there to begin with, let alone a soul. The audience involvement in the victim's body accomplishes different functions in both cases, wherein the former example might communicate the end of an individual, meanwhile the latter puts to question what the individual was in life. Both are technically body horror, but again, the intensities vary greatly. I think one of the best examples of this body horror scale can be observed in werewolf transformations in media. In films like Twilight, the mechanics of the transformation are not emphasized, as it happens magically in a blink. The goal was, after all, to have a werewolf love interest and not the excruciating material experience of a human morphing into a wolf. While media like American Werewolf in London and Hemlock Grove do the opposite, showing every single tear of skin as bones buckle and rearrange and human skulls protrude into wolven jaws. It is primarily the focus on the materialness of a body that can make these transformations so disturbing. Then, beyond visuals, we have the narratives of body horror. Here it is important to say that body horror stories can be divided into narratives with body horror elements and narratives explicitly about body horror. An example of a story with body horror elements would be Spider-Man. We may, in a sense, think of Peter Parker's sudden bodily changes as thematically similar to body horror, although the film does not frame them through a horrific lens. Peter's ability to produce webs from his hands could be portrayed as disturbing, but the focus of the typical Spider-Man narrative is rarely about confronting one's corporeal being, as Spider-Man actually becomes more resistant to damage thanks to his superpowers. On the other hand, Spiders-Man, plural, a version of Spider-Man made up of 1,000 spiders, aligns with a narrative explicitly about body horror, as the image of a humanoid body composed entirely of spiders prompts the audience to imagine the real-world ramifications and the deeply visceral sensations of inhabiting such a form. Narratives about body horror allow their viewers to seriously dwell on the experience of having a body, not flinching away from social stigmas around the subject. As mentioned in Yara Zaid's Catharsis of Body Horror, the representation of bodily torment can situate us in our own body, prompting us to imagine and inhabit such agony, or to be grateful that our body is spared of such suffering. Finally, we should consider the subjects of body horror, or more accurately, the varieties of body horror. In real life, the human body can be broken in an endless number of ways, and that is even more true in our media, where the laws of our new realities deform our flesh by otherwise impossible means. We will try to group different kinds of body horror into general categories, and thankfully we are not the first in this endeavor, as Huckvale, in his book Terrors of the Flesh, Philosophy of Body Horror, presents 8 categories of body horror, including birth, reproduction, mutation, mutilation, digestion, infection, disintegration, and finally extinction. This list is arguably one of our best tools for examining body horror, providing a basic list of body horror tropes alongside an analysis of each category's underlying philosophies. However, this list is not exhaustive and its categories could be expanded. One helpful way of distinguishing these classifications is to consider the different kinds of fears that body horror entertains, to understand the deeper anxieties explored in a given piece of media. For example, dismemberment horror functions very differently from sensory deprivation horror, such as denucleation, even though the two are quite alike. Where one plays on the loss of capacity for action, the other plays on an inability to perceive, which are ultimately different anxieties. Additionally, we can divide body horror into 2 overarching categories: additive and subtractive. This is my own interpretation. Where subtractive body horror, such as the loss of limbs, organs, beauty, etc., plays on our concerns about our identities, exploring how much we can be reduced before death takes us, additive body horror, such as mutation, growths, fusing bodies, etc., plays on a similar theme of questioning one's identity, but this time by making one reflect on losing themselves within their own body. Both these categories also apply to bodily functions. An example of a subtractive function would be the loss of really any bodily ability, such as mobility, speech, attractiveness, and so on and so on. This loss of abilities that one thought to be integral to who they are forces one to reflect on how much of their identity is ultimately tied to their slowly decaying body. Meanwhile, an example of additive functions in body horror would be sexual body horror, encompassing birth and sex, where the individual is made to wrestle with their body having new functions that do not align with their perceived identity. And on the side note, additive body horror is generally the more monstrous in media, where the subject undergoing transformations becomes a threat to those around them, like we see in The Fly, Tetsuo the Iron Man, Akira, Doom, and so on and so on. In this sense, body horror is an exceptionally effective art form for reevaluating the borders of who we are, be it by expanding the borders of our flesh or shrinking them. We will return to this point later. This rundown of the subgenre so far is ultimately but a glimpse into the more common readings of body horror, of which there are too many to include in this essay. However, I would like to focus on a part of body horror that is often severely underlooked. When it was first put on screen, the subgenre of body horror was indeed the peak of terror, but no longer. Where once there was a shocking spectacle of bodily annihilation, we are now left with apparently harmless images losing their horrific potency, and in turn serving entirely new functions for their audiences.
Numbness is the result of any prolonged terror. The price of eternal vigilance is indifference.
For perspective on how body horror has changed, consider this. In their 1993 book Cinematic Bodies, while discussing Cronenberg's body horror, Shavir suggested that the new technologies of late capitalism, far from erasing our experience of the body, in fact heighten this experience by investing that body in novel and particularly intense ways. While this vision for technology may have once held a truth, the catharsis of novelty turned out to be only temporary. Thus, those experiences of unfathomable intensity have over time become but a dull numbness. Just think on the early screenings of the first Alien film. They were disturbing enough that some audience members vomited or ran out of theaters, but now the audiences are far less affected by such imagery. Fear peters out, and thus we begin to observe the once horrific through new lenses such as fascination and eventually even boredom. So what does a genre characterized by its evocation of fear become when it stops evoking fear? Well, one transformation of body horror subgenre has been its rapid proliferation. We may think of body horror in our media as some random flash of momentary grossness that we ultimately put behind us and move on with our lives. But the imagery of body horror has become more pervasive than ever, if not because of an increase in the number of body horror media pieces being made today, then by the sheer accumulation of these representations in public consciousness over the decades. Often body horror imagery in media is no longer the centerpiece of terror, but a backdrop. This phenomenon is especially easy to see in gaming, where body horror enemy design has become the norm. The image of a walking corpse alone is now so popular in Western culture that the number of zombie films could constitute a full zombie horde. Now, I'm not saying that, oh god, the youth is corrupting itself by looking at disgusting things, the West has fallen! Rather, our media is allowing us to see something much clearer than we ever have before. We are not necessarily becoming worse or better because of our media, but it is reshaping us, extending our senses in new directions while reducing our senses in other ways. We will return to this point in a few minutes. Let us now consider body horror beyond its fear qualities and see how this incomprehensible gore has spilled into our lives and identities. To do so, we must bring our attention to the mediums of body horror and see what the genre has always envisioned for our future. Amidst the images of tearing flesh, it can be easy to forget that body horror as we experience it in our media is indeed only possible because of our mediums. Video games, films, digital art, CGI, AI, etc. are our main ways of perceiving body horror, for the majority of modern body horror is primarily witnessed through electric mediums. Even physical artworks of body horror are most commonly seen through screens spread by social media. How is it significant? Well, here comes in Marshall McLuhan, the father of media studies. This man will come up a lot on this channel. For context, McLuhan was absurdly ahead of his time. He completely reframed how we think about human bodies in relation to their mediums. One of his core ideas is that the medium of a message is more important than the message itself, often boiled down to the phrase, the medium is the message. You might have heard it before. Now, not to suggest that the content of our mediums is entirely irrelevant, but that the medium carries more value than we consciously acknowledge. While McLuhan has had many revolutionary insights into the workings of media, his concepts of sensory ratios, the relation of print technology to newer electric mediums, and the role of art can help us completely rethink the value and place of body horror in our culture. Let me explain. As people of the most media-dominated century to date, we should all be familiar with McLuhan's conception of the sensory ratios, for it is one of our best tools for understanding how different mediums change us. He explained that as our media extend the scale of a particular human sense, the ratios of our senses shift, and as a result, the other senses grow more numb because of that extension. So, it might sound complicated, so here's an example of this concept in practice. Shoes are one example of a medium. For McLuhan, mediums are almost kind of synonymous with technologies, so bear with me here. Our shoes extend the scope of our activities, enabling us to perform new functions on a greater scale, such as walking farther and faster over rough terrain, but in the process, we lose the sensation of the ground under our feet, trading the sense of touch for the enlargement of our walking capabilities. Suddenly, humans can walk where they could not go before, thus creating new, broader standard for the scope of human activities that the rest of humanity must acclimate to if they don't want to be left behind. But simultaneously, we become less sensitive to the textures of our environment. Besides just the term sensory ratios, I will refer to this relationship of bodies and mediums as the media-body circuit, wherein we shape our mediums, and in return, our mediums shape our bodies. Now, this dilemma is more important than ever because today we find ourselves in the electric age, where we are still only beginning to grasp the ways in which electricity as a medium is changing us. Electricity has extended our bodies into unfathomable configurations. For example, through electric technology such as the internet, our senses reach to the furthest corners of the globe. Even in the comfort of our homes, we see and hear practically anything in the world, for the internet directly extends our nervous system, stretching our nerves across continents. Meanwhile, our bodies are easier to disregard than ever. Just put on some headphones or a VR headset, and there. I'm not saying that our bodies go anywhere, but that so much electric technology is encouraging us to decenter our corporeal selves and become one amongst billions in digital spaces. In this haze of extensions, the human body is becoming harder than ever to precisely locate and define. Additionally, the process of locating ourselves in the electric age is all the more challenging because in our circuits of bodies and mediums, the mediums have also been disappearing, not from reality, but from our perception. Electricity is perceptually instant and practically invisible, and so are electric mediums. We tend to notice them in our lives only when they are directly discussed or when they malfunction. As an example, when we text someone, we generally think about the process of texting and not the smartphone itself on which we are texting. As Mark Weiser, the father of ubiquitous computing, once said, "The most profound technologies are those that disappear. They weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life until they are indistinguishable from it." And in a more literal sense, the material qualities of our mediums, such as wires and other electronic components, are often concealed. Just think of the standard design for Apple devices, all sleek and spotless, hiding their inner mechanisms from our sight. So indeed, both mediums and bodies have been steadily disappearing, for over time the mediums have become unnoticeable to us, and the interaction with our mediums can make us forget about our bodies, which is unfortunate as both play such a substantial role in our current affairs. Now, returning to body horror, it may seem like just another art form, simply content, but I would argue that its concern with the body and not necessarily the human enables a necessary reflection in the electric age, allowing us to see our new material components and find our bodies once again. You see, media content about mediums, for example, a TV show like Black Mirror talking about the effects of specific mediums, enables us to reflect on our mediums by reminding us that there are in fact mediums and not just content. Which again is especially important since our electric technologies often appear as invisible as a result of their ubiquity. But then, consider the media body circuit. It involves our bodies just as much as our mediums, for one is the extension of the other. Thus, we cannot disregard the body in favor of a purely electric focus, which again leads us to body horror. Where so much media content portrays what might happen to us in X scenario, body horror art acknowledges that what we mean by us is indeed our bodies. As a result, body horror speaks to the source of our identities and anxieties, contorting our bodies directly. I, we, or whatever identity we may be discussing is ultimately the content of a body, like a TV show is a content of a screen. An identity is a product of its material elements. We may watch a film with characters going about their stories, identities interacting with other identities, but it is rare that we are forced to confront the material, fleshly nature of said characters. I doubt you're watching Lord of the Rings and are actively pondering the corporeal nature of Frodo like, I wonder how much of his identity is tied to his eyesight and liver health. Meanwhile, body horror is less concerned with the content of our identities than it is with our flesh as a medium. The depictions of meat changing function as reminders of our bodies, which make us aware of how the borders of our identities are unstable and may already have been subject to many transformations without us even realizing. Considering how seamlessly the electric age is designed to function, it can be easy to forget that modern humans are no longer constrained by the surface of their skin. Thus, body horror can be seen as a tool for locating our bodies in our new media-twisted landscapes. Back to the discussion of mediums, while our electric mediums conceal themselves and our bodies, they too herald the collapse of boundaries. Our mediums determine how we perceive and conceptualize reality. As an example, when you read a book about World War I, you get an entirely different picture of the subject than when you watch a documentary about World War I, even if the content of the two mediums appear to be nearly identical. Now, over the last few centuries, we have gone through a titanic media upheaval, the consequences of which we are still attempting to grasp. But this kind of media shift has happened before in our history. In his book, Gutenberg Galaxy, McLuhan identifies that print culture, the type of culture where the predominant medium is the printed word, made humanity into a site of fragmentation and individuality. Usurping oral cultures like we've seen with the history of colonialism, the medium of print promoted a visual, linear organization of society, leading to scientific and mechanistic thinking, which then created cultures that hyper-specialized and sought to categorize the reality into distinct sections, raising concrete boundaries between what things are and what things aren't. In a sense, humanity of the printing press has for centuries organized the world into distinct glass jars that we have labeled and therefore thought to have somehow mastered. But, for the last few centuries, print has been steadily usurped by new electronic mediums, and as a result, our methods of organizing and perceiving reality are also changing. The glass jars delineated by print cultures are beginning to shatter, and their contents are once again mixing. Like body horror, TVs, computers, phones, etc. all promote a vision of reality that destroys our old borders. Even time does not separate concepts anymore, for the speed of electricity is perceptually instant. Now, surely you've heard about the recent declines in literacy. Well, this reality is often framed as some indicator of increasing public stupidity, but in truth, it shows that we are steadily moving away from literate mediums like books and towards electric mediums of orality and images, such as smartphones. For comparison, a similar shift has already occurred when the oral cultures of antiquity invented the written word. Think of Socrates condemning writing, as he feared it would sabotage our memory by offloading that task to texts. Well, here we are, 2,000 years later, and most can't recite the Odyssey. Damn. Are we worse off for that? Debatable, since we can still read it. It is clear that our mental faculties have shifted in new directions as a result of literate technologies like books. And now, electricity is doing to literacy what literacy did to orality. Our sensory ratios are shifting once more, and we cannot help but feel like we are losing something as we acclimate to new mediums. Notably, in this acclimation, we begin to take on the traits of our mediums, which for electricity is instantaneity, much like fragmentation was for print. As a result of this immediate logic of electricity, our activity will only continue to accelerate and become increasingly borderless. On a side note, Anna Kornblue explores this subject at great length in her book Immediacy, or the Style of Too Late Capitalism, arguing that our culture is only continuing to speed up by removing mediation from our perception. But to give examples of this border-breaking characteristic of electricity, consider the following. Electricity unifies all of humanity not in a utopian sense, but in a way that forces us to be involved in everything all at once. Most of our activities are tied together through electricity: industries, food storage, transport, light, entertainment, you name it. All content of electricity. McLuhan called this the global village.
Ours is a brand new world of all-at-onceness.
Global village is not created by the motor car or even by the airplane. It's created by instant electronic information movement. The global village is at once as wide as the planet and as small as a little town where everybody is maliciously engaged and poking his nose into everybody else's business. The global village is a world in which you don't necessarily have harmony. You have extreme concern with everybody else's business.
Through electricity, the scale and speed of human activity has become incomprehensibly giant, sending us even into outer space. This trend of electric speed has culminated in the invention of the internet, which takes the instantaneous logic of electricity to its conclusion. The World Wide Web contains practically any function one can imagine, accessible in moments, steadily removing concepts of mediation and specialization in favor of a swift and broad variety of functions. Electricity's ability to melt categories together is only further emphasized by recent developments with generative AI, where the logic is an instantaneous merging of data from a wide range of sources. We are not incentivized to engage with anything deeper than its surface, while engaging grows more arduous as the sheer scale of our options has become perceptually infinite. Just think of how one typically engages with a basic search engine like Google or Firefox. We may delve 1 or 2 pages into our search, but we so rarely have to dig into the web for answers. And now, with AI assistant tools, search engines are incentivizing us to interact in an even more shallow way. But then, even more egregiously, our involvement with everything all at once is made into a constant condition through the technology of the smartphone, where, in every element of our lives, we're always connected, inseparable from the infinite functions of the internet. Endless non-involvement in everything and everyone, but only as deep as our screens. Alright, now, returning back to body horror, as I previously said, over the decades we have grown numb to its shock. But interestingly enough, this numbness coincides with the physical sensation of body horror in our media, for it is painless. We may witness the most dreadful contortions of the body, like we see in Hellraiser, but no matter how invested we might be in the happenings on our screens, we ourselves do not experience this pain. Sure, we can imagine it if we try, but at its core, body horror revels in imagery of absurd agony without us ever feeling it ourselves. If you have been looking at your screen throughout this video without actively cringing or looking away, I believe you have proved my point. We are left with soulless images of ruptured meat, but those images have not changed. It was us who have changed. And when we look into the mirrors of our screens and see human bodies warping in impossible ways, when we truly sit and ponder these images, we can finally begin to see something new in the gore, perhaps something even more disturbing than its initial shock. Let us avoid the error of Narcissus and realize that in the mirrors of our screens, amidst the suffering viscera, we can begin to see ourselves. Body horror, in its many variations, can be understood as our most accurate reflections of the electric human. In the swirl of organs, animals, wires, and machinery, electricity has reduced the human to a soup. So many boundaries have collapsed that it has become difficult to care. Once body horror was a warning of what was to come, but today we're already there, and maybe even beyond. Dead, living, good, evil, woman, man, animal, environment, technology, etc., the human being is lost in the whirlpool of these fluids. We have become so enmeshed with our technologies, so torn apart by our mediums, that if we could visibly see all the ways in which we have expanded or shrunk, our most horrific conceptions of body horror would be considered tame. For example, media like Scorn begins to scratch at this reality, acknowledging mediums to be extensions of the body and as such making its environments like a body as well. But even then, it does not grasp the sheer scope of our modern bodily expansions, although it does offer a glimpse of the truth behind our condition. At this rate, the patterns of today will only continue to intensify tomorrow. Thus, body horror can also be a tool for identifying where all these transformations of electricity have been leading us over the centuries. For while we are already deep into the metamorphosis, the process of change is not yet over, and we still have the chance to anticipate who we will become tomorrow.
The artist is the man in any field, scientific or humanistic, who grasps the implications of his actions and of new knowledge in his own time. He is the man of integral awareness. The artist can correct the sense ratios before the blow of new technology has numbed conscious procedures. He can correct them before numbness and subliminal groping and reaction begin. I'm curious to know what would happen if art were suddenly seen for what it is. Namely, exact information of how to rearrange one's psyche in order to anticipate the next blow of our own extended faculties.
So, finally, consider this. Art beyond just self-expression may be seen as holding a prophetic quality, or at the very least a quality of awareness that allows us to gradually acclimate to new modes of being. One function of art is that it is an early warning system that explores new mediums and heralds how our sense ratios will shift in the coming times. You may already see where I'm taking this. The ever more prevalent body horror art may prophesy our new modes of being. Whether we knew it or not, body horror imagery has been preparing us for decades for our current condition, acclimating us to the gradual collapse of boundaries brought on by our new media. This acclimation is generally more metaphorical, but nonetheless useful to us by offering new lenses for understanding our current human condition. So thus, functioning as a tool for locating the modern body, a reflection of the media-twisted human, and a prophetic art form, body horror must continue to be studied, for with it, we can reframe what humans have become in the electric age, and anticipate the next blows from our own extended faculties. Thank you all so much for joining me on this journey. Now's the point where I ask you to consider your own experiences with body horror. How has body horror affected you personally? What do you see in the cadavers that others do not? And how has this gruesome art reframed your perspective? I encourage you to share your own art, write your own essays, or engage with others about the subject. I hope that the next time you encounter body horror in your media, you will see in it things you have not previously. In the coming essays, I will offer you more lenses to analyze the various categorical components of body horror. If you enjoyed this video and are hoping for the continuation of the series, please consider subscribing, supporting the project on Ko-fi, or joining my Discord community. This video took over 150 hours of work, but I was of course not alone. Massive thanks to my friend Leonardo Martins for his guest narration and feedback on my script, and thank you to my partner Abigail for her editing throughout the script, as without her help this channel content would probably be incomprehensible. Thank you to several friends who gave their constructive feedback but chose to stay anonymous, and of course, thank you to A Dark Soul and Xyleros for their donations on Ko-fi. The next video should come in the following months, likely shorter than this one, or so I hope. With this body horror video series, I will focus as much on specific trends in body horror as specific pieces of media, such as Look Outside, Dead Space, the recent Frankenstein film, and whatever else I deem fitting for the series. You're always more than welcome to give me suggestions. This particular video was ultimately just the groundwork for many of my coming projects and could be seen as a kind of introduction to this channel, as I would rather not define body horror each time I do a video. Also, on a side note, I'm considering streaming games relevant for my research. Please let me know in the comments if this is at all something any of you would be interested in watching. Alright, do you have any questions? Is there something you hope I cover in this video series? I intend to take all the feedback and move forward with this research alongside all of you. Finally, I have a strong suspicion I may have to blur parts of this video series in the future, in which case I will upload the uncensored versions on my Ko-fi. So, with that, I believe we are ready to rethink body horror. Thank you all so much for your time, have a wonderful day, cheers.